I am Pedro, nice to meet you all. As Ismail said, I am here funded by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, writing a paper on authoritarianism and democracy and the colonial legacies of that dichotomy around those concepts. My presentation today is not about that. This presentation is on my previous work on the processes of state formation and capitalist development in Brazil. And so what exactly am I talking about here? I came into this by studying the histories of the international order, right? The histories of modernity in a global sense. And this big thing, modernity, is, of course, many different definitions. People come up with lots of different things to fit in that box. But these two things are usually there, and they're usually very important parts of that concept, whatever that is, which are the fact that the world is divided among many territorially sovereign political authorities, states, and that they're all interconnected in this broad network of trade, production, finance that is global capitalism. And these things, well, first of all, this is not a natural thing, right? There's no seed that you plant and that grows a state tree or a capitalism tree, right? It's not a natural phenomenon, it's made. And these are also two different processes, right? Many people usually will reduce one to the other and say, for instance, that the development of capitalism is only understood because states compete. And because states compete with each other, because there are states and they compete with each other, then capitalism develops. Or the other way around, right? That there is such a thing as capitalism and that depends on the existence of a multiplicity of sovereign states for some reason. And what I'm trying to do here is part of a rejection of both these reductions. I think these things need to be understood as separate but interconnected processes. And if they are understood, regardless of that, right? Another question I present in these narratives is, okay, but what is the space of Latin America as a whole, and Brazil in particular, in these histories of global development? And what I find is there is a very loud silence about the role that Latin America plays in these processes of modernization of the international order, of the creation of global capitalism. Mostly because most of these narratives are built from a Eurocentric perspective, right? So they are, states are something that developed in Europe and then it simply spreads around. Capitalism, the same thing. The one big exception is that one that gravitates around the idea that the origin of capitalism is inherently tied to the conquest is a bad word, to the colonization of the American continent from early 16th century onwards, right? So the colonial conquest, the colonial expansion of Europe is the very first step of global capitalism. That is an idea that is shared by world systems theory, by dependency theory. It's present as well in most of decolonial theory in Latin America. People like Quijano, for instance, heavily depends on that. And my point is that by arguing that, right, if you argue that capitalism is then this practice of conquest and the creation of this global division of labor, of this articulation of many forms of labor control in Quijano and Palestine, for instance, that is a way of emphasizing totality, right? Which is very explicit in Palestine, it's very explicit in Quijano. And it emphasizes totality in the sense that the unit of analysis is the system as a whole. And what happens in the parts is understood always in context of, or if we're being more critical, in consequence of the systemic changes, right? And that is precisely how Wallerstein explains, for instance, the processes of state formation in Latin America. They are the result of this hegemonic dispute within the core between France and Britain of how to replace the Iberic period of Iberic hegemony. And out of that dispute you get the whole Napoleonic Wars, and that's the change towards a sovereign system, in that the expansion of the sovereign system to Latin America. And the next big change in Latin American history that must be explained, then the development of underdevelopment, in the famous France formulation, comes much later, in early 20th century, also as a symptom of a different, as an outcome of a different hegemonic dispute in the core, where you have the rise of the United States as a new hegemon, and I'm using the term hegemon very broadly here, of course, which triggers a new form, a new articulation, a new global division of labor in the world system. The result of that narrative is a very long silence about what happens in the 19th century. What happens between the formation of the sovereign state and the beginning of capitalist development, or underdevelopment, right? Then you have pretty much a century which is held as not a problem, as just structural continuity. And I find that a problem. Why is that a problem? Because if you come from a different perspective, and you don't accept the idea that the colonial process as a whole was already capitalist, that the Portuguese colonization in Brazil was not a capitalist process, then the transition you need to explain, the creation of a sovereign state, the rupture with the old colonial order, and the beginning of capitalism, it all takes place precisely in that period that this other narrative overlooks. Then the challenge I'm facing here, that I dealt with in that paper I circulated, is precisely this, right? How to deal with this great transformation in the 19th century. How to deal with all of these different processes that again, as I said at the beginning, are different processes. They're not reducible to the same thing. And just as a matter of historical contextualization, right? I mean, as you probably noticed already, this is a very long historical discussion. Here I cannot possibly go into details of everything that happens in the 19th century or in the colonial period or anything. That was a big trouble I had in the thesis. Welcome to my life. But essentially what I'm speaking of here are these three central aspects, right? The formal independence in the 1820s, the abolition of slavery, and the transition to a republican government in 1888, 1889, and to speak in very traditional terms, the take-off period. Sorry, I don't know if it's qualified technically as a take-off in Rossovian terms, right? But anyway, the beginning of industrial development in the early 20th century. And that is precisely the kind of transformation that is usually linked in a tradition of sociology to the idea of a bourgeois revolution. And within Brazilian sociology, that is also often described as Brazil's bourgeois revolution. And I don't quite like that. And I will explain why. So the first step is to go into, I do that in the paper in much more detail and trying to compress all the theory stuff, leave it out. it depends on this idea of the bourgeois revolution, right? So what exactly is that? What ideas do we bring to the table when we call things bourgeois revolutions? So going back to Marx, of course is the big proponent, it's the big name who made bourgeois revolution a relevant concept today. And in his ideas, of course, global development takes place revolution per revolution, right? So he's thinking of a bourgeois revolution that will trigger capitalist development, which would be followed by a proletarian revolution that would trigger socialism and bring the downfall of the capitalist system. And in the way he describes that, the way he describes those processes, he uses these expressions, these revolutions, in two meanings, right? There is a tension between the global conception of what these things are, right, and the local conceptions, right? I mean, at the same time, he uses bourgeois revolutions, to keep with that one, that's probably enough, to speak of this global transformation, of the rise of capitalism in a global level. At the same time, he refers to individual revolutions as the English Revolution, as the French Revolution, as bourgeois revolutions. And that has a problem of transference, right? If he admits that these revolutions change the precondition, they change the starting point of the next one, right? Because they're all internationally connected, the international system exists. Then they're not exactly the same. If they're not exactly the same, they can't have the same effects, they can't work exactly in the same way, but still they are part of this broader transition. So he has this sentence, right, that although these two revolutions, the English and the French one, are not merely English and French, they're also revolutions of an European pattern. They're revolutions that create this transition to a broader global capitalism system. And he even continues that, the continuation of that sentence goes like, they are a victory of modernity against the old regime, they are victories of science and reason against culture and religion and whatever. And this idea of the birth moment of modernity is strongly there. And summing up, he does ascribe to the idea of bourgeois revolutions three elements, right? So they do trigger a transition to capitalism. They are made by a bourgeoisie, a rising bourgeois class, against the ancien regime, against absolutism, feudalism, what have you. And interestingly, by the and that has been traditionally the most accepted notion of what bourgeois revolutions are, and the most accepted understandings of what these two revolutions are. And by the 1950s, we start having a revisionist historiography of the French Revolution that looks into more details about what it was. I'm thinking of people like Colomb, for instance. And by looking at that in detail, and more recently, the work of Xavier Lafrance, for instance, on the capitalist transition in France, they get into a point where they really look at what happened, how these two revolutions stand up to what they're expected to be upon this broader frame of bourgeois revolutions, and neither of them seem to fit the concept, right? So if your two main cases that justify the use of a concept are not themselves good enough for what you expect them to be, the concept is broken, right? So in a short formulation that Communal comes up with, while in the English Revolution you have a capitalist revolution that is not made by the bourgeoisie. In the French Revolution you have the opposite, you have a bourgeois revolution that does not trigger capitalist development. Then, if that's the case, then we need to rethink what these revolutions are and how capitalism comes into being, right? Unless you disagree with that. And you need to uphold the concept of bourgeois revolution, and then you change its definition, right? Which is the consequentialist position offered by Neil Davidson, the book on the left. that consequence, he comes up with a proposal he proposes what he calls a consequentialist definition of bourgeois revolution, which is to say, essentially anything that triggers capitalism can be called a bourgeois revolution. So, because the concept was broken, the response is to stretch it even more. And it's precisely in that sense, right? I mean, if anything that triggers capitalist development is a bourgeois revolution, if you find capitalist development anywhere, there must be a bourgeois revolution that preceded it to make it possible. And that is pretty much what Florestan Fernandes does. Now, just as a historical point, Florestan, I'm not saying Florestan Fernandes is himself precedes Davidson in any way. However, the argument he's making is precisely that, right? I mean, he says at the beginning of he writes that book, A Revolução Burguesa no Brasil, and he opens that by saying, listen, of course I'm not saying that Brazil repeats European history, but it does present some it shares in common some parts of its recent past. And these parts of its recent past are what allow us to speak of a modern Western civilization in Brazil. So if this modern then again, if this modern Western civilization, aka capitalism, exists in Brazil, then it's because Brazil repeats this recent part of European past, which is the equivalent of a bourgeois revolution, as he goes on to say. He argues that this bourgeois revolution takes place in 3 steps, of which I'm going to discuss mostly the first 2, mostly the second actually. The first one is what he calls the unmaking of the colonial order, which takes place between 1808 and 1888. It's a very long process that entails, as I said before, formal independence up until the downfall of slavery. So 1808 is when the Portuguese court moved to Rio. Which, by the way, parenthesis, is, as far as I know, an unparalleled event in human history, right? I mean, the fact that an European empire was ruled by one of its colonies for 12, 13 years, it is something huge. It's a huge particularity. It's unique. And I completely fail to understand why people don't pay attention to it that often. I mean, I wrote a paper on that, but despite that, no one seems to read my paper on that. Anyway, the other thing is, that first step, unmaking the colonial order, you have formal independence, and then you get rid of colonial slavery. From that point, we can start now that we have a state, and it's a state that is no longer based on enslaving people, we can speak of its transition to that new civilizational pattern, right? We can speak of the ways in which that society adopts this new civilizational pattern, adapting itself to that. And in his argument, that transformation takes place through the actions of 2 fundamental social actors, which are, one of them, the coffee oligarchy, that in that period goes through this transformation from between as they used to be masters and lords in a slave society, to becoming citizens and farmer businessmen is the expression that he uses. And as part of the reasons for that transformation are many, and they vary from the different qualities of the coffee plantation itself, that it being it taking a longer time to grow than other traditional colonial products such as sugar. It requires much more stable investment. So the initial investments, it's much more important, and the ties that are required between these plantations and finance are much more stronger. So there's a much stronger presence of financial investment, and the logic of capital accumulation is much more present in these planters than in other examples of other historical examples of our elite, which is part of what triggers this capitalist change in them. And also, you get this transition towards rationality, right? I mean, they have these coffee planters, they start promoting academic journals, right, on how to make coffee more productive, how to make more profit with their same plantations, and so on. On the other side, and also important to say, is the dissatisfaction of this coffee elite with the monarchy, right, which is what triggered in them the intention to move towards a liberal order of citizenship, of equal citizenship, and opposing to the monarchical order of having an aristocracy or everything around the emperor. That is related to the geographical pattern that I have there on the corner of coffee plantations in the 19th century. So as you see, especially the spread towards the western portion of São Paulo, the yellow area, there in the left. These are planters that are further and further away from Rio. So they do not see themselves represented in court, they do not have their voice heard by the emperor as much as those other planters from their traditional area in the Paraíba Valley there, in the lower part of the land. And also by being far away, going back to the financial point, by being further away inland, they require transportation, right? So those are the first railways built in Brazil to transport their coffee to the sea. And those are also made by British investment, all of them. So right, that's your bourgeoisie, right? You have your coffee elite with a rational mentality, developing capitalism through these infrastructural projects. And on the other hand, you have immigrants, right? Brazil goes through a massive influx of immigrants in late 19th century, early 20th century. And according to Fernandes, the role of these immigrants are essential for this capitalist transition because they infused capitalist mentality within Brazilian middle class. So it's that story of they come to Brazil with the idea of working and accumulating through their work. They find in the very rigid traditional structures of Brazilian society up until then a limitation that they then wish to overcome. And it's also by that effort of accumulating, these immigrants display a stronger tendency to vary their accumulation strategies, right? So you will find them working in cities, in the urban, they become the early urban proletariat. They go to the farms to work in plantations. Some of them accumulate and become themselves businessmen. Lots of them become industrials in São Paulo. But that's it. Like, so that's the second step of Fernandes' transition, which is consolidated for him with the coup in 1930 that brings Getúlio Vargas into power. There is a third step which he mentions, which is how political development takes place from then on. I'm not going into that here. I'm just going to mention that because it has a lot to do with my project on authoritarianism. He does say that that entails a conservative consolidation of the bourgeois order, which is the fact that this new bourgeois elite leaves itself open the possibility of retracting into its authoritarian past, which is how he explains the dictatorship in the 60s, for instance. But then again, that's scenes of my next presentation. You will see me again in a few months. Okay, then my point is, I have problems with the historiography that Fernandes is mobilizing to make this argument, right? So, first of all, there is a conceptual issue, right? You will notice that when I was presenting his argument, I said he uses competitive social order, modern pattern of civilization, and the closer he gets of calling that capitalism is when he says something like a competitive order based on money and on profit, something like that. And, you know, I'm separating these issues, right? I'm saying these are separate things. The social transformation entails both the transformation in state and the rise of capitalism, because they are separate processes. You cannot just mesh them together in this big network of a changing social order or whatever. And for the same reason, since just to go back to the point I was making earlier about the colonial period, it's insufficient to, the idea that capitalism is simply producing things for profit, for sale in the market, is also insufficient, right? If you accept that, then you have to go back to, well, then in the colonial period there was already capitalism, because that's exactly what that elite was doing. So it must be a different thing. It entails people who have no alternative of reproducing their social life other than selling whatever they have on the market. And I need to make the case that these two actors identified by Florestan are not that, right? Firstly, the coffee oligarchy, these guys control the state, right? They have a very strong foothold on what Brazil does before and after the Republic in 1889. Which gets, I mean, if we stretch that back, we go into a process of class differentiation within the Second Empire that I don't have space or time to do here. But the fact is that, and also the coffee planters in Brazil at that time, they're very close to a global monopoly on coffee production, right? I think by 1890, Brazil produces more than 80% of the world's coffee. So their main competitors, firstly, are themselves, and by controlling the state, they can make sure that all of them will have their profits safe, which is exactly what they do. I'll go into that in a bit. And the immigrants, on the other hand, most of the immigrants that come to Brazil in that time, they come to plantations to replace a labor force that was there and is no more. And they do that through sharecropping contracts, right? These are not wage laborers. The double freedom that Marx describes in Capital is not there. Especially because, for instance, some of the part of the design of these contracts was made to fixate these workers geographically, because it was not interest for these planters who were paying for these tickets of these workers into São Paulo to bring them to the western part of the state, and then having them leave after a year to go work in São Paulo or in Rio. So you needed to find a way to make them, stabilize them in the land far away from these big cities. And that's what part of the contract was designed to do that. So, if these are not market-dependent social relations, then who are? Like, where do I find them? I find them in towns. So what I find, the beginning of Brazilian capitalism is then, it takes place in Brazilian cities, in the development of Brazilian industry, also in this period of the late 19th century. But it depends not exactly on immigration, but on this growth of Brazilian cities, of the process of urbanization that takes place a bit before, right? So going back to the 1860s, you have a boom of Brazilian cities that is in itself very much related to the abolitionist struggle, right? By the 1860s, the practice of quilombos of creating communities of runaway and formerly enslaved people, they begin to organizing, rather than organizing themselves as separate communities, they begin to organize within the Brazilian cities, with creating networks of solidarity and help with the pre-existing middle class. And they manage to maintain some sort of sustainability for a while, but as these communities grow, as cities grow, their access to land is insufficient. And they begin needing to get their food, their sustenance somewhere else, which is the main element of the development of this internal market of foodstuff in Brazil in the late 19th century. And by the same time, you also have a rise of a rising industrialization in Brazil. So the story of industrialization in Brazil is very tied to the agrarian sector. So it's industries that produce tools for the countryside, that produce parts for the railways that are being constructed at this time. But you always have, with the development of this internal market and the growth of urban populations, you also get lots of other industries that are built upon the necessities of these people that cannot afford, as cheap as they are, British imports, right? Which is how Brazilian cities are equipped at this time, which is how the market is, which is where the offer comes from in this period. So you start to get a development of industries of woolens, of shoes, hats. Okay, I'll be in a hurry. So yeah, it's urban growth, industrial growth is, and these industries, they do compete internally, right? They do struggle with each other. However, that does not mean that this urban industrial bourgeoisie are necessarily in conflict with the other elites, right? Especially because, as I said, they do have a very symbiotic relationship. I'm not sure symbiotic is the right word, I'm not a biologist, but here we go. The point is, in São Paulo, right, the political organization of both these elites, they are held very tightly together in the Paulista Republican Party. Right? That's the channel through which all of this elite is represented in the federal government in the early 20th century. However, as I said before, this coffee elite controls essentially the Brazilian government, not only the federal government, but also São Paulo's provincial government. And through that means, they do these policies of coffee valuation schemes. So coffee goes through many crises, and in this early 20th century, the commodity price oscillates a lot. And their backup against that, rather than developing, then again, it goes back to market strategies of reproduction, right? Rather than competing to outbid the farm next door, producing coffee more effectively, what they do instead is get the government to supply them all with, well, not to supply them, to buy all their coffee production, which is what they do repeatedly in early 20th century. And they get to do that, important to say as well, by securing British loans. It is British money, it's the Rothschilds, I guess, once again, coming in with loans to the Brazilian state, with which they can buy all the coffee there is. Which then again makes the Brazilian public debt grow a lot in this time, which at the same time makes it harder for this bourgeoisie, for this industrial bourgeoisie, to buy capital goods, to import capital goods. That's the beginning of the strife, of the internal division. These industrials create the Center for Industry in the State of São Paulo, the CIESP, which is nowadays FIESP, the Federation of Industries in the State of São Paulo, which is the main representative of Brazilian industry since then. And it's one of its founding members, which is Roberto Simonsing. Part of his opening speech has that line, right? Brazilians who oppose dissemination of industries do so at the service of foreign nations. Already projecting there this very different vision for what Brazilian development is and what development must be. What's the role of the state and the relation between state and society that triggers this notion of development. So this dispute between them, and although that center is created to dispute power with the coffee oligarchy within the Republican Party, but that does not go much further, because in 1930 the other Republican parties in other Brazilian states stage is not the right word, they promote a coup d'etat that brings Vargas into the presidency. Of course, the Paulista oligarchy did not like that. They had elected the president that was couped. And they managed to raise in rebellion. They organized a rebellion against Vargas in 1932, which is defeated. And that defeat, I mean, is a military defeat, right? There is a sort of civil war between São Paulo and the rest of the country in 1932. And after that, Vargas brings some of these industrialists within the Republican Party in São Paulo closer to him, and eliminating the influence of the rural aristocracy from São Paulo's political power. From then on, that guy, Simonsen, which is one of the men in that photo, the second one sitting from right to left, becomes one of the most influent policymakers in São Paulo's, in Vargas' industrial policy. Right, so he brings one of CIESP's one of the main industrialists in São Paulo to be one of his main policymakers, one of the main policymakers for industrial development in the 1930s. And that is the transition that brings the federal state on board of the developmental project of industrialization of the Brazilian bourgeoisie, of urban capitalism in Brazil. That is the story I wanted to tell. I skipped a lot of things because I was rushing for time. I had no idea it would be that long. I apologize. But that's it.